Alright, I got two stories that involve a controversy over what the bet was. One player thought the bet was something else, one player thought the bet was something else. The floor needed to be called, and the floor had to make a decision. But the point isn't the rulings, the point is how I handle them. I'll explain at the end. Alright, so the first time it was debatable whether the bet was 30 or 75. I ruled it 75, and the player who was facing the bet didn't agree, and let me show you what the player who made the bet did first, and then I'll explain what happened right after that. Okay, so let's pretend where those two cushions meet, that's the rail, chips, cards. One thing that was a little odd, and I'm using these great Sandia cards I got for signing up for a player's card when I was there in March. One thing the player did, a lot of players have their cards a little more back. He had his cards a little forward than normal, and also instead of sideways, which a lot of players have, he had them like vertically. So the front edge of his cards was like this far away from the rail instead of what like a lot of players have where it's like there. So those two factors made it such that the front edge of his cards were farther from the rail than normal. So he came out to like around here, around the front edge of those cards. He had some chips, he broke them down, then he got some more together, and eventually it was like that many, and then he had them in stacks. Eventually he had 75, and then he pushed them like forward to here. And I waited for all that to happen because he was working behind the front edge of these cards, even though they were a little more ahead than most players' cards would be in the 4-seat. But I waited for him to do everything, then push him out here, and then the 1-seat said, no, the bet isn't all that, the bet is what first came out. One thing, which it's not in the manual, but like in pro sports, I like to make a ruling first that's clear what I thought before possibly calling the floor over. So I said, yeah, like it was close, but he was working like even with the front edge of his cards, so I would call that 75. None of the chips came in front of all the cards until that whole stack of 75 was together, so I would call it 75, but I'll call the floor if you want me to call the floor. So the 1-seat asked for the floor to come over. I explained the situation. The floor said it was going to be a bet of 30 because the cards were kind of farther out than most people would have their cards. He called it a bet of 30, and then the 1-seat was the other player in the hand. Then the 1-seat facing the bet of 30, he acted. The other situation, I'll get to the results and the bigger point later. The other thing was the other hand. It was the 1-seat against, different day, but the 1-seat versus the 7-seat, and the 1-seat came out. You know, you could bring out a stack and you can cut and release and you could bring some back. So this move is completely legal. Let me show you. You came out. That's totally legal. You came out with some amount of chips, but you broke down some, brought these back. Okay, the bet is right there, which is 45. What the player did, it was kind of slow. I still called it a cut and release, but let me just get the perfect amount of chips first. So he came out, and it was a cut and release. It was just like slightly in slow motion. He came out, he definitely released half. He had 5, he had a 10 in his hand, so he definitely released half. So he came out, then like 5 were not in his hand anymore, and instead of what normal people would do, like here, here, and that's it, like fairly quick, it was just a little slower. He came out like, he didn't come back. That's much different than if you came out, dropped half, and then came back. That's not legal. That would just be the first amount. I mean, his hand never came back. He was just kind of slow to like put them in 2 separate stacks, and the 7-seat had a problem with that. So the 7-seat said, no, that's just what first came out, 25, and I said, I mean, it's a cut and release. It was slightly slower than most people would do it, but you know, I'm calling that 50, but if you want me to call the floor, I'll call the floor. She wanted me to call the floor, I called the floor. The floor said, yeah, that's, you know, cut and release. Like the speed doesn't really matter. The fact that his arm never came back, like behind his cards, meant like he wasn't done. He's allowed to do it like slightly slower than most people do it. And it was a bet of 50, and then she acted on the hand. If you want the results in that first hand, it was ironic because I got the feeling the 1-seat would not have called 75, but he did call the 30 and he lost. In the second hand, I actually don't even remember what happened. It was definitely deemed a bet of 50. And then I think the 7-seat folded. But I'm telling you these two hands because often my first reaction is to like be aggressive and almost argumentative back. I usually need to hold back from doing that. There are times to do it. There are times I like having that reaction. Like when those two lunatics, during the summer, one guy just wouldn't stop shouting slurs, and one guy got really mad every time I wouldn't let him break rules. I don't mind in those situations. There was also the guy who we thought was going to throw a punch and then formally got ejected for destroying casino property. But in other cases, that's usually my first reaction, just because when any type of controversy happened as a kid in school in New York, if you didn't respond that way, you were probably going to get eaten alive. So that's always my first reaction. Now, dealing as an employee and in Vegas, a lot of things are different. Usually still think that first, but fight that first response. And in both cases, even though the players facing the bets didn't like what I ruled, they didn't have a problem with me. The first player in seat 1 who thought the bet was 30, not 75, and I didn't get mad, I didn't get defensive. I just told him what I was ruling and why, and then asked if he wanted me to call the floor. He called the floor, and then the floor ruled the way he wanted the floor to rule. After the floor ruled, he thanked both of us. He wasn't very exhaustive on why. Seemed to think for a pleasant, efficient floor call process. Even though he called the 30 and lost the hand at showdown, he liked how we handled it. And also, he didn't hate me or anything, even though what I ruled wasn't what the floor deemed afterwards. Him and his friend were in seats 1 and 2. I greeted them when they came into the room. Briefly, while I was on break/brush, I was at the desk, so I greeted them. I put their names on the list. Shortly after they came in, we got 2 or 3 more people to put their names on the list. We opened a table, and then since I was the one breaking/brushing, I was the one who opened that table. I took their players' cards, I gave them chips, and I dealt their first hand. This was a later down at that table, and I even dealt, I think, one more down at that table before that table broke for the night. But the entire time, that guy's friend, didn't have a problem with me before then. Even after that, both of them kept being respectful and polite and kept tipping me. So even though I deemed it 75, he disagreed. The way I reacted didn't make that player hate me or anything like that. In the second situation, I had dealt that table. I think that was also the second table, the second of 3 downs I dealt at that table. In that situation where it was the guy who cut the 50 out slowly, and then the 7-seed didn't agree with what happened. But I had dealt that table. That was either my first or second down of the night, and then this was when I was back there later, and then I think I was even back there one more time before that table broke. But the same thing. Before that, the woman in seat 7 had no problem with me, and she was being polite and respectful and tipping. Even during that hand, when I ruled it 50, she disagreed, and then the floor said it was 50, and she still disagreed. She for some reason had a problem with seat 1. Seat 1, I don't know if his first language was English, and when he did speak, it wasn't very loud. He was kind of saying something when the floor came over and asked me what happened. The floor was asking me, but often players respond to those questions. He was saying something. I mean, this guy was directly on my left, and I had trouble making out what he was saying. The 7-seat seemed to think he was saying something that wasn't true, and she kind of had a problem with how the 1-seat was reacting during this process. But she didn't have a problem with me. She didn't have a problem with the floor, even though both of us said it was 50 and she thought it was 25. I think she folded that hand, so lost via folding, but I dealt her plenty of hands from that point till the end of the night. I dealt her plenty of hands that she won, and she continued to tip me. I think she played a fair number of hands that were blind versus blind, so $6 were in the pot when the pre-flop action was done. Those hands mostly went nowhere, except for those hands. Any pot that got to just double digits, $10 or more that she won, she tipped me. So she didn't have a problem with me. I didn't get aggressive, I didn't get mean, I didn't get defensive, and just the way I handled the scenario, both scenarios, even though both players disagreed with what I ruled first, neither player had a problem, because I was polite and neutral, and very quickly made a clear ruling, and then very quickly said, if you want me to call the floor, I'll call the floor, and I was unbiased in both situations. So Yeah, I usually, my first instinct is like, be mad back and like really fight for why I'm ruling what I'm ruling, because I think that's right and I think any other side is wrong. But I don't know, usually doesn't lead to anything great. So even though I feel that instinct first, just I want to be clear and efficient, and if the player wants me to call the floor, usually call the floor. A couple times at Orleans, a player who was doing something real shady wanted me to call the floor and waste a ton of time, and I said I'm not wasting the floor's time over this. But in cash games where there is you know, a gray area, a debate over what happened, player wants me to call the floor, just make a clear ruling, stay neutral and unbiased, and say if you want me to call the floor, I'll call the floor though. And players rarely have a problem with me after that, regardless of how the floor rules. And remember, rice is a spoon food.